उसके बाद ये आपको 3 टर्म्स नजर आ रही हैं, वेरियस टाइप्स ऑफ कंट्रैक्शन, जिसमें टोनिक कंट्रैक्शन है, फेजिक कंट्रैक्शन है एंड रिफ्लेक्सिव कंट्रैक्शन। इनका क्या मतलब है, क्या होती हैं, होगा क्या? What is the tone of the muscle? मसल टोन किसको कहते हैं? शर्जील इकबाल,
सर क्वेश्चन रिपीट कर दें एक बार।
टोन ऑफ मसल किसको कहते हैं? व्हाट इज द टोन ऑफ द मसल?
टोन ऑफ मसल सर
जी,
सर मतलब अगर वो मसल जो है वो रेस्ट पे है, उसके अंदर कितनी टेंशन है और कितना रिस्पॉन्स करता है आउटसाइड फोर्स पे, इस हम टोन मसल।
आप वैसे ये बता दें कि जितनी ये स्केलेटल मसल्स हैं, वॉलंटरी मसल्स हैं, ये ऑल द टाइम फ्लेक्सिड होते हैं या दे आर इन द पार्शियल स्टेट ऑफ कॉन्ट्रैक्शन?
पार्शियल स्टेट ऑफ कंट्रैक्शन।
This partial state of contraction is called the tone of the muscle.
सॉरी सर इसका नहीं पता।
So the tone of the muscle is the partial state of contraction. Then we move on to the phasic contraction, what it can be.
Excuse me sir. सर तो जो पार्शियल स्टेट ऑफ कंट्रैक्शन है सर वो आप स्केलेटल में बता रहे हैं?
स्केलेटल में भी होगी, टू सम एक्सटेंट स्मूथ मसल्स में भी होगी, लेकिन क्योंकि स्केलेटल मसल में सब मसल्स में होती है ये चीज़ है कि जो एक ग्रुप ऑफ मसल्स एक ही फंक्शन परफॉर्म कर रहा है, दैट हैज द पार्शियल स्टेट ऑफ कॉन्ट्रैक्शन, बट देयर इज मोर continuous state in the skeletal muscle, which are the voluntary muscle, in order to maintain the posture. So that is mostly studied or discussed in the skeletal muscles.
Okay sir.
The balance between the flexor and extensor muscles lead to certain movement or the posture of the body. So that partial state of contraction or relaxation is called the tone of the muscle. And the partial state of contraction means that if there are 100 fibers within the muscle, only 5 or 10 are in the partial state of contraction and rest are relaxed. So that partial contraction is called the tone of the muscle. Then we move on to the phasic contraction. Any idea or the worldly meaning of the phase?
The willful active contraction of skeletal muscles.
It can be एक contraction phase आएगा कि जिसमें if we have to perform a movement, the muscles will voluntarily contract and then later on they will get relaxed. So that is a phasic contraction. And within the category or type of phasic contraction, there are two different mechanisms. One is that the length of the muscle fibers remain the same, but the tension of the muscle itself, the tension on the specific muscle increases. And in other case, the length would reduce, but the tension would be the same. So what terms it would be we will be using for these situations or these conditions? If you study whenever we use the prefix ISO, that means same or similar. Okay, and later on we will be using two terms, isotonic and isovolumetric. What would be the difference between these two, isotonic contraction and isovolumetric contraction? Isotonic, iso means same and the tonic means the tone of the muscle remain the same. So that would mean the muscles would contract in such a manner that the tone remains the same. The positioning of the muscle is so that the tone remains the same. And in isometric contraction, the tone would increase, but the size or the mass of the muscle would remain the same. Is this idea or concept clear or not?
सर आइसोवॉल्यूमेट्रिक दोबारा बता दें.
Isovolumetric is that the size or the shape of the muscles remain the same, whereas the tension or the tone in the muscle fibers would increase. So, to understand these conditions, you may make the concept of lifting a certain weight. If the heavy object is carried or lifted in a static position, for example, you lift it from the ground and keep it in the air at a certain level, so that would be the volume would remain on the same muscle volume, but the tension would increase. So that is isovolumetric. And in isotonic, the muscle length would change, but the tone in the muscle fibers would remain the same. So you can have a read of these concepts and we can discuss it in the next lecture. Isovolumetry and physiology. In physiology, you will be reading them as well. Have you started the unit of muscles in physiology?
Yes, sir.
So these terms would be used by now in physiology, isovolumetric and isotonic. And what would be reflexive contraction? We are talking about the worldly meaning of these terms.
सर जो अपने कंट्रोल में नहीं होगी, अपने विल में नहीं होगी, वो रिफ्लेक्सिव होगी.
Correct. That is a contraction of the muscle in response to a certain stimulus, but that is involuntary. Okay. Have you seen the sliding filament model of muscle contraction in the skeletal muscles? Animation or the concept of the muscle contraction?
Yes, sir.
So what happens in it?
Sir, in sliding filament model of contraction, when muscle contracts, the H zone disappears, the A band remains constant, and lines get closer to.
Okay. Just a minute. And is this video visible to you?
No, sir.
Now?
Yes, sir.
यार वीडियो की आवाज ही नहीं आ रही।
Let me check it.
The contraction of a skeletal muscle generates the force necessary to move the
अब आवाज आ रही है इस वीडियो की?
Yes, sir.
skeleton. A contraction is triggered by a series of molecular events known as the cross-bridge cycle. In a skeletal muscle fiber, the functional unit of contraction is called the sarcomere. A sarcomere shortens when myosin heads in thick myofilaments form cross bridges with actin molecules in thin myofilaments.
So video नहीं show रही.
सर वीडियो
अच्छा जी।
The formation of a cross binding causes troponin to change shape. Tropomyosin away from the myosin binding sites on actin, allowing the myosin head to bind actin and form a cross bridge. Also note that the myosin head must be activated before a cross bridge cycle can begin. This occurs when ATP binds to the myosin head and is hydrolyzed to ADP and inorganic phosphate. The energy liberated from the hydrolysis of ATP activates the myosin head, forcing it into the cocked position. A cross-bridge cycle may be divided into 4 steps. Step 1. Cross-bridge formation. The activated myosin head binds to actin, forming a cross bridge. Inorganic phosphate is released, and the bond between myosin and actin becomes stronger. Step 2. The power stroke. ADP is released, and the activated myosin head pivots, sliding the thin myofilament toward the center of the sarcomere. Head detaches. Step 4. Reactivation of the myosin head. ATP is hydrolyzed to ADP and inorganic phosphate. The energy released during hydrolysis reactivates the myosin head, returning it to the cocked position. As long as the binding sites on actin remain exposed, the cross-bridge cycle will repeat. And as the cycle repeats, the thin myofilaments are pulled toward each other and the sarcomere shortens. This shortening causes the whole muscle to contract. Cross-bridge cycling ends when calcium ions are actively transported back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Troponin acronin returns to its original shape, allowing tropomyosin to glide over and cover the myosin-binding site on actin.
So now we will be starting with the today's lecture of neuromuscular junction. So now can anyone tell me how the nerve impulse moves on and this leads to the contraction of the muscle? Anyone? How the muscle contracts in response to the nerve impulse?
कैल्शियम आयन की रिलीज होने की वजह से
कैल्शियम आयन की रिलीज से, ठीक है. What is the difference between the diade and the triade? Muscle diade and muscle triade.
तो मसल ट्राइएड तो एक साइकोप्लाज्मिक रेटिकुलम और जो ट्रांसवर्स ट्यूब्यूल होती है उनकी वजह से बनता है ट्राइएड फॉर्मेशन, ट्राइएड ट्रांसवर्स ट्यूब्यूल.
Okay. The muscle triade is present in skeletal muscles, where it is biade or diade in the cardiac muscle. Okay. So to start with, the neuromuscular junction is, as the name indicates, it is a junction or connection between the nerve ending and the muscle that would lead to the contraction of the muscle in response to the nerve impulse. So what would be the components of this? The terminologies that we will be using for it, that there is a motor end plate, which is the name given to the neuromuscular junction, because at the end of the nerve there is a skeletal or the contractile tissue that leads to contraction in response to the nerve impulse. Then is the synaptic gutter. What it would mean? The gutter is the term that is used for a depression or a cavity, and as it is present in the synapse between the nerve ending and the muscle fiber, so that is called the synaptic gutter. Then is the synaptic cleft or the synaptic space. That is the space present between the nerve ending and the surface of the cell membrane, that is called the sarco. Cell membrane of the muscle is called
Sarcolemma.
sarcolemma, correct. Okay. And this space is about 20 to 30 nanometer, in which the neurotransmitters would pass from the nerve and will reach the receptors on the membrane of cell membrane of the muscle, and that would lead to the opening of ion channels. Then is a subneural clefts. What it would mean? the clefts or spaces that are present on the neuronal side between the membrane of the nerves neuron and the contents. Synaptic vesicles are the one which carry the neurotransmitters synthesized by the Golgi apparatus. ATP or adenosine triphosphate is the chemical molecule that provides energy for opening of ion channels, and acetylcholinesterase is an enzyme that is present in the synaptic cleft. And what it would do? What would be the function of
Break acetylcholine.
it would degrade or G.
Subneural cleft का एक दफा repeat कर दो please.
In the next diagram, as we will go to the neuron, I'll be talking about it.
Okay,
It is the space on the inner side of the neuron between its substance and the cell membrane.
Okay, sir.
And acetylcholinesterase is an enzyme that degrades the acetylcholine or the neurotransmitter and helps in the relaxation of the muscle contraction. So, to define the neuromuscular junction, it is the motor unit that is formed by the two components would be the terminal end of the nerve fiber, and on the other side there would be the surface of the muscle's fiber that would be the receiving end. So it is the motor unit formed by the terminal end of motor nerve, and the motor nerve is which part of spinal nerve?
Ventral root.
Ventral roots. Okay. ठीक है जी, ventral roots of the spinal nerve जो है वो motor fibers हैं and ending at the muscle fiber which has the receptors, and functioning of the neuromuscular junction is dependent on the release of neurotransmitters in response to action, potential or nerve impulse. The neuromuscular junction में होगा क्या कि nerve impulse that is generated or passing in a nerve fiber that would cause the calcium influx within the nerve fiber, and this calcium would lead to the release of acetylcholine that is stored in the synaptic vesicles. हमने बात की थी कि यहाँ पे synaptic vesicles आ रही हैं. These were the synaptic vesicles that store the neurotransmitters that in most of the cases is the acetylcholine. Okay. So the functioning of the neurotransmitters is dependent on the nerve impulse. Then the calcium influx would lead to the release of acetylcholine, where it would release in the gap or space between the nerve and the muscle that is called the synaptic cleft. This acetylcholine will then bind to the receptors present on which surface? Acetylcholine is released in the synaptic cleft, sarcolemma or the cell membrane of the muscle which has the receptors for it. And that binding would lead to opening of channels on the muscle's fiber membrane. When these channels open, there is again the influx of ions in the muscle fibers now. So this concept should be clear that first the nerve impulse runs or transmits to the nerve fiber, leads to calcium influx and release of acetylcholine. Then the acetylcholine moves through the space between the nerve fiber and the muscle and binds to the receptors on the cell membrane or the muscle fiber. When the ion channels open, there is an influx into the muscle fibers now, and that would lead to generation of action potential. And when the threshold is crossed, it would lead to the contraction of muscle fiber. So as long as the acetylcholine is bound to the receptors, there would be influx of ions in the muscle fibers and the muscle would continue to be in the state of contraction. The enzymes acetylcholinesterase now degrades the acetylcholine. When the acetylcholine is degraded, what would be the fate of acetylcholine? It is broken down into the acetyl component and the choline. Which component would be retaken up by the nerve ending? Acetyl or the choline part?
Acetyl part.
And that would lead again to the synthesis of the new acetylcholine molecules or the neurotransmitter. And when these are broken down or degraded from the receptors on the muscle membrane, the ion channels close. There would be efflux of ions and the muscle would be in the state of repolarization. Now we see these areas. This upper one is the nerve ending and lower down is the muscle fiber. So these are the subneuronal clefts which are below the neurons and outside the membrane of the muscle. So it is. So what steps we started in the conduction of nerve impulse through the neuromuscular junction? First, there would be a nerve impulse running in the neuron. That would lead to opening of the influx of calcium ions. When these calcium ions move or influx in the nerve ending, they bind to the synaptic vesicles that are mostly having the acetylcholine as neurotransmitter, and this leads to binding of synaptic vesicle with this neuronal membrane, and by which process this neurotransmitter is released?
Exocytosis.
Exocytosis. That means that these stored chemicals are released, but the vesicle itself or the cell membrane remains intact. So these acetylcholine released in the cleft would move to the would enter into the synaptic cleft, reaches the cell membrane of the muscle, binds with the receptors. There would be opening of the receptors on the muscle membrane, leading to the ion influx in the muscle, and that would lead to the generation of action potential when the threshold is crossed and the muscle would contract.
To open, increasing the calcium ion permeability of the presynaptic terminal cell membrane. Calcium ions enter the presynaptic terminal and cause vesicles to release their neurotransmitter acetylcholine from the synaptic vesicles into the presynaptic cleft. Diffusion of acetylcholine across the synaptic cleft and binding of acetylcholine to acetylcholine receptors on the postsynaptic muscle fiber membrane causes an increase in the permeability of ligand-gated sodium ion channels. The movement of sodium ions into the muscle cell results in depolarization of the postsynaptic membrane. Once threshold has been reached, a postsynaptic action potential is generated and is propagated over the muscle cell membrane. Acetylcholine is rapidly broken down to acetic acid and choline in the synaptic cleft by the enzyme acetylcholinesterase. The choline is reabsorbed by the presynaptic terminal and combined with acetic acid to form more acetylcholine, which enters the synaptic vesicles.
प्रोसेस को देखिए। सो एक चीज, one thing is clear now that the choline component is reabsorbed, not the acetic acid.
An action potential arrives at the presynaptic terminal, causing voltage-gated calcium ion channels to open, increasing the calcium ion permeability of the presynaptic terminal cell membrane. Calcium ions enter the presynaptic terminal and cause vesicles to release their neurotransmitter acetylcholine from the synaptic vesicles into the presynaptic cleft. Fusion of acetylcholine across the synaptic cleft and binding of acetylcholine fiber membrane causes an increase in the permeability of ligand-gated sodium ion channels. The movement of sodium ions into the once threshold has been reached, a postsynaptic potential is generated and is propagated over the muscle cell membrane. Acetylcholine is rapidly broken down to a
Just a minute.
An action potential arrives at the presynaptic terminal, causing voltage gain.
Is this video visible to you all?
An action and cause vesicle depolarization of the postsynaptic membrane. Once threshold has been reached, a postsynaptic action potential is generated and is propagated over the muscle cell membrane.
No, sir.
Okay.
Acetylcholine is rapidly broken down to acetic brain. Once threshold has been reached, a postsynaptic receptors on the postsynaptic muscle fiber membrane causes an increase in the permeability of ligand-gated sodium ion channels. The movement of sodium ions into the muscle cell results in depolarization of the postsynaptic membrane. Once threshold has been reached, a postsynaptic action potential is generated and is propagated over the muscle cell membrane. Acetylcholine is rapidly broken down to acetic acid and choline in the synaptic cleft by the enzyme acetylcholine esterase. The choline is reabsorbed by the presynaptic terminal and combined with acetic acid to form more acetylcholine, which enters the synaptic vesicles.
Is it clear till now?
Actually, the choline
Okay. So having a look at the mechanism by which the neuronal transmission occurs across the neuromuscular junctions. Now we'll see that the drugs which have the acetylcholine-like action, which act as the acetylcholine because of the similarities in the chemical form, methacholine, carbachol, and nicotine. These are the one when used, they lead or act like acetylcholine. Nicotine is the one that keeps a person alert and that has the same reasoning. They are not or slowly degraded by acetylcholinesterase, as acetylcholine is the substrate for this enzyme, but not these chemicals. They keep the ion channels open with the influx of sodium into the muscle and keep the muscle in the state of contraction. And finally, when it continues for a long time, eventually the muscle would go into the condition of permanent state of contraction that is called the muscle spasm. And they do not let the muscle fiber repolarize as the ion channels are not closed. Then there are certain drugs which inactivate the enzyme or degrade the enzyme, which are neostigmine, physostigmine, and diisop.
सर एक सर्टन जब थ्रेशोल्ड पोटेंशियल आ गया उसके बाद हमारा वोल्टेज पोटेंशियल आ जाएगा और वोल्टेज के अंदर सर डीपोलराइजेशन के बाद रीपोलराइजेशन की स्टेट आती है। जब एक सर्टन पोटेंशियल की रेंज आ जाएगी तो पोटेशियम चैनल्स ओपन हो जाएंगे और सर वो रीपोलराइजेशन स्टेट को मेंटेन करेंगे।
ठीक है।
तो सर निकोटीन, इधर हमने पढ़ा कि निकोटीन रीपोलराइजेशन नहीं करवा, निकोटीन ड्रग्स
they act like or similar to that of acetylcholine. So when these are used, they keep the ion channels permanently open and not let them repolarize.
सर ये तो सिर्फ लिगेंड ऑपरेटेड चैनल्स को कर सकती है ना सर, वोल्टेज को तो ये कंट्रोल नहीं करते बाइंडर वाले।
लेकिन जो न्यूरोमस्कुलर जंक्शन के अक्रॉस रिसेप्टर्स हैं, they are not ion voltage gated, ठीक है?
यस सर।
महबूब बच्चे, आप मुझे जरा बता दें कि निकोटीन क्या एक्ट करती है? जी, फिर ऐसी कुछ ड्रग्स हैं जो एंजाइम को डिग्रेड कर देंगी एंड नॉट लेट देम degrade the acetylcholine, which are neostigmine, physostigmine, and diisopropyl. These inactivate acetylcholinesterase, leading to again sustained prolonged contraction of the muscle, and again it will lead to muscle spasm. And if it includes the laryngeal muscles, which are of the voice box or the vocal cords, so if they continue to be prolonged, so they can lead to the death of an individual because choking ho jayegi and the air cannot move into it. Then diisopropyl is a strong nerve gas poison and has the action for weeks. So these are the chemicals which have adverse effect. And what can be the other mechanism by which the transmission across the neuromuscular junction can be blocked? These are the chloroform drugs, for example, D-tibocurarine. And what these would do, they block the action of acetylcholine on the receptors and will not lead to the opening of ion channels on the muscle, and the muscle would not contract. Then we see the few clinical aspects which are related to these transmission of nerve impulse across the neuromuscular junction. So, applied anatomy of the muscle with reference to spasm. What is a spasm? What
permanent state of muscle contraction.
permanent state of muscle contraction और अपनी लोकल जुबान में इसको और हम क्या कहते हैं? The cramping, the जी we talked about the neostigmine, physostigmine are the chemical compounds that degenerate or deactivate the acetylcholinesterase enzyme, leading to the continuous opening, a sustained opening of the ion channels of the muscle, and the muscle remains in the state of contraction. That is called the muscle spasm. And laryngeal muscles, if remain contracted, they would block the airway and the individual can die out because of it. Then paralysis. What is a paralysis? What is
Immobilization.
immobilization. Why and how?
Due to motor dysfunction.
Dysfunction, right? We studied in the neuromuscular junction that the nerve impulse would approach through the nerve, releasing the neurotransmitters, causing the muscles to contract. If that nerve fiber bringing the nerve impulse to a certain muscle is damaged, the nerve impulse does not run in the neuronal fiber, the muscle would not get any neurotransmitter or generation of action potential. So that would remain in the state of relaxed condition, not innervated. When the nerves are damaged, the muscles are paralyzed. It is a condition when the innervation or the nerve supply of a muscle is cut or lost and leads to the loss of muscle action, contraction, or movement. And when the tone of the muscle is lost, we said initially in the revision on the last lecture that the partial state of muscle contraction is called the muscle tone. So when the nerve impulse is cut or the nerve fiber innervating it is damaged, the muscle tone will be lost and the muscle would become flat and flaccid. And what is myasthenia gravis?
It is an autoimmune disease in which the acetylcholine against receptors are formed.
Anyone else?
Acetylcholinesterase receptors are destroyed.
And it is an autoimmune disorder, or what kind of disorder it can be?
Autoimmune disorder.
It is an autoimmune with the occurrence of one individual in 20,000 cases, and it is caused by the production of antibodies that act against acetylcholine-gated sodium channels in the surface of the muscle membrane. The end plate potential generated is weak enough for the muscle to contract. So, to treat this condition, neostigmine or anticholinesterase drug is given. We studied that the neostigmine would inhibit the action of acetylcholinesterase. When that is blocked, so the amount of acetylcholine accumulated within the synaptic cleft can somehow lead to the opening of ion channels. If no treatment is given, then the result leads to the paralysis of the muscle, and if the respiratory muscles are involved, it can lead to the death. What is
end plate? Sir, end plate potential क्या है?
The nerve impulse generated or the action potential generated on the muscle membrane. That is the end part of a neuromuscular junction.
Okay.
अच्छा जी. Atrophy, hypertrophy, hyperplasia, what are these terms? जी.
So means कि अगर action potential नहीं generate होगा end plate potential तो muscle paralyze हो जाएगा.
Muscle would not contract. Paralysis is the condition in which the nerve fiber is cut off from the neuromuscular junction or the muscle. If the conduction problem is there, that would be a flaccid muscle but not paralyzed. The paralyzed is the condition in which the nerve fiber is cut and there is no nerve impulse. But in myasthenia gravis, there is an abnormality in the transmission of nerve impulse from the nerve to the muscle. Okay. What is hypertrophy, hyperplasia, and atrophy? These terms need to be understood. Anyone?
Increase in size or mass of muscle fiber is hypertrophy. Increase in number of muscle fiber is
hypertrophy leads to increase in the number of muscles or size of the muscle.
Size.
Hypertrophy increase in the size of the muscle, but the number of the muscles remains same. Hyperplasia is the condition in which there is an increase in the number of muscle cells, but the size would increase due to the increase in the number of muscles, but the individual cell size remains the same. Okay, so this is the difference between the two hypertrophy. Exercise say size of the muscle increase कर जाता है, but the number of muscle fibers or cells.
सर सेल साइकिल में हमने पढ़ा था कि स्केलेटल मायोफाइबर्स और कार्डियक मायोफाइबर जो सेल्स होते हैं ये G0 फेज में होते हैं, G0 में. तो फिर सर हाइपरप्लेजिया किस तरह हो सकता है? तो नंबर इनका कैसे इंक्रीज हो सकता है अगर ये G0 में है? हाइपरप्लेजिया हमेशा
अच्छा
G0 स्टेट में सर अगर रहेंगे.
ठीक है. हाइपरप्लेजिया नॉर्मल बाकी बॉडी में नहीं होगा, जब जरूरत पड़ेगी तब होगा. Example for the hyperplasia is during the in the uterus. अगर आप देखते हो, so that is hyperplasia, because when the size of the uterus has to increase, that would need to increase the number of muscle cells. Or in some cancerous condition, that can lead to the abnormal division of the muscle cells to increase the number. So these are the two situations in which the hyperplasia is seen, but not in the normal routine life. The uterus has to increase in size during the child development, so that has to increase the number of muscles. So the cells which are in the G0 or the resting phase will be stimulated to divide and produce more cells to increase the size. And after the childbirth, these cells degenerate and the uterus regresses to the normal size. But in the tumorous conditions, when there is some tumor or cancerous growth, which is unproportional to the required size, that will be hyperplasia and that will not be the controlled one. And the atrophy is the degeneration of the muscle fibers. Okay, degeneration is the condition developed after the muscle paralysis. If first the nerve innervation was lost, muscles stopped to function. Due to the non-functioning, the proteins degenerate, and that is called atrophy. And mostly it is seen when after God forbid, after a road traffic accident or a fracture, when the plaster of Paris is applied. So those part of the limb are not functional or not moving, and they undergo disuse atrophy. But once the plaster is removed, with the physiotherapy or exercises, the muscle can regain. And we are talking about the last part, that is the regeneration.
Excuse me,
What
sir?
is G?
Sir, in hyperplasia, you have said that the number is increased, but the size remains the same.
Yes.
Sir, but if the cells are dividing to form new cells, then how the size of the those dividing cells remains the same if they form new cells by division?
Cells by division, but they also get the nutrition and the proteins from the surrounding area or the blood vessel. So they would, when the cells mature, they regain their size.
Okay, sir.
Okay. So the regeneration is the formation of new cells that is only possible in the smooth muscles. That is from G0 stage to the developed mature cells. Only possible in the smooth muscles. Example is the proliferation of myometrium of uterus during pregnancy to meet the increased demand and requirement of the muscle action. Skeletal muscles and cardiac muscles do not have the ability to regenerate. Regrow and regeneration are two different terms. Regeneration means from the stem cell a new tissue is generated, and repair or growth is the one which is the filling up of the damaged area by the already present cells. So is it clear?
सर एक मत बात दोबारा बता दें.
अच्छा, regeneration का मतलब ये है कि जी जो stem cells which were not demarcated for any specific type of muscle cells, when G0 phase में, when they are stimulated, they can lead to the formation of smooth muscles. That is regeneration. ठीक है, लेकिन जो skeletal muscles हैं, cardiac muscles हैं, they do not have such ability or property to regenerate and form the new muscle. If sartorius muscle is removed from the body due to some injury, new sartorius will not generate. Right? But when the part of the intestine is cut, the cut margins rejoined by the process of regeneration. That is the difference between the two. Okay. So any other question?
सर synaptic gutter और synaptic cleft में क्या फर्क होगा?
Okay. Other question that was being asked.
नहीं सर, मैंने एक्चुअली दूसरा क्वेश्चन पूछना था किसी और चीज के रिलेटेड.
ये पूछने में मैं दोनों का इकट्ठा जवाब दे देता हूँ.
सर मैंने पूछना था जिन स्टूडेंट्स ने रीस्टेज देनी है उनका वाइवा बेस्ड होगा या एमसीक्यू बेस्ड, और दूसरा ऑन कैंपस होगी या फिफ्थ को ही होगी?
इंशाल्लाह फिफ्थ को ही होगी. ठीक है. और जो उसका पैटर्न है अभी हेड ऑफ डिपार्टमेंट मैंने तहीम ने बताया नहीं है, जैसे वो कहेंगे जो उसके अकॉर्डिंगली मैनेज हम करेंगे. अच्छा, जो सिनेप्टिक गटर है बच्चा, वो है कि जो डिप्रेशन ऑन द सरफेस मेम्ब्रेन ऑफ द मसल है, दैट इज द गटर. ठीक है. एंड क्लेफ्ट इज दैट स्पेस that is present on one side by the cell membrane of the nerve and on the other side by the cell membrane of the muscle. A depression in the muscle is the gutter, whereas if this is concavity, so this will be the gutter, synaptic gutter. But if there is a space between the two cell membranes, this is the synaptic cleft.
Okay, sir, thank you. Sir, हम कह सकते हैं कि हाइपरप्लेजिया सिर्फ स्मूथ मसल्स में हो सकता है.
जी.
ओके सर.
Sir, which part is taken up by the muscle, choline part or acetyl?
Choline. Acetic acid is degenerated.
सर अगर मसल को इंजरी हुई है तो वो रीजनरेट तो नहीं कर सकता, लेकिन अगर थोड़ी बहुत इंजरी हुई है तो वहां से मसल दोबारा आ जाएगा.
Depending on the extent of injury, if there is a small area, so that is get healed by the scar tissue. only smooth muscles would divide to fill up the space, whereas in skeletal or the cardiac muscle, they will not be regenerating, but the gap would be filled by the connective tissue. You have heard the cardiac ischemia of the cardiac muscle. Okay, so that part of the muscle would die out, will be there, but not regenerate to function again. Allah Hafiz.
Allah Hafiz, sir.
Record